is Christ accepting of people? Through Matthew's gospel so far, we have seen Jesus say crazy things like, "Not everyone who says to me, 'Lord, Lord,' will enter the kingdom of heaven." He comes out and gives two different groups of people who are on a wide road, the way to destruction, the road that almost everybody is on, and then those who are on the narrow road, which can't even be seen without the Spirit's help, who are on the narrow road and going through the narrow gates of life. And so, no, Jesus doesn't accept everybody. Jesus actually, it's kind of surprising. You read through the whole of the Gospels, it seems to me that Jesus spends an awful lot of time trying to convince people not to follow him. And just some of the things he says, it's like, if your only goal is to get people to follow you, why do you say that? And it's because that's not Jesus' primary goal, right? His primary goal is glory of the Father, exaltation of the Son, salvation of God's chosen people. And we're going to see some of that in the text for today. The big question I want to consider is the purpose of evangelism and missions, and the work of evangelism and missions, and how our practicing evangelism missions actually reflects who God is and his character and the work that he has done. And we'll consider these three questions on the board as we move through the text. First is this: what is God's purpose for missions and evangelism? The second is this: how might we give in to fearing people rather than fearing God? Sorry if my F looks a little weird.
Yeah, that was an S. I was like, what the heck is that?
What might we...
Oh, yeah, it looks like a seer.
How might we give in to searing people? Or rather... Sorry. Just because I'm pursuing a PhD, I have to have terrible handwriting. That's one of the requirements. It really said that on like the requirements for doctoral work. It says you have to have terrible handwriting. No, I'm not serious. Number three. What is the difference between inward and outward focus, and why is it important? And so we're going to see all of these things represented in this part of the text, the passage for today. If somebody would be so kind as to read Matthew chapter 10, verses 24 through 33, that would be amazing. Thank you. We'll see this passage in three parts. First we'll see verses 24 through 26, and we'll see the purpose of missions and evangelism. And then we will see verses 27 through 31, and we'll see the work of evangelism and missions. And verses 32 through 33, and we'll see, I'll call it reciprocity, because work of evangelism and missions actually reflects something about who God is and his character and his work. So, verse 24 and 25, the purpose of evangelism and missions. Starting in verse 24 here. A disciple. Who are the disciples that Jesus might be referring to here?
Oh, yeah. The 12 disciples.
The 12 disciples, right? In context, Jesus is giving his 12 disciples this short-term mission trip. He's sending his apostles, missionaries, on this short-term mission trip, and that's the context we're in. And so when Jesus gives this general teaching, this is going to be a general teaching. It's probably something that was popularly taught, during the day, and something that seems to be obviously true. Jesus is referring to his disciples, and who's the teacher then? Jesus. Jesus is the teacher. A disciple is not above his teacher, nor a slave. Who's the slave? The disciple, the apostles in this context. Nor a slave above his master. And who's the master? Jesus. It is enough for the disciple that he become like his teacher, and the slave like his master. So Jesus is the teacher. The apostle is the student, the disciple. And he's sending these guys on a short-term mission trip. They haven't gone yet, right? Jesus is still giving them instruction. These are a lot of instructions that Jesus is giving them before actually just sending them. But here we see this general truth, right, mentioned. What does it mean that a disciple is not above his teacher? And what does it mean that the apostle or disciple of Jesus Christ wouldn't be above Christ, or the slave the slave of Christ wouldn't be above the master, Jesus Christ. What are some ways do you think disciples, or people who claim to be disciples of Christ, try to be greater than Christ, other than what was just mentioned over here? Like, I have this little bit of knowledge, so all of a sudden I think I'm the stuff rather than Jesus or whatever. What would it mean, like, if John Smith, as a disciple of Jesus Christ, or someone who claims to be a disciple of Jesus Christ, acts like or thinks somehow that he is greater than Jesus Christ? What would that even look like? Jesus is emphasizing the fact that those who follow him and who sit under the authoritative teaching of his word will never surpass him or earn different results than he does through his own evangelistic and missions ministry on this earth. The disciples' purpose is not different than Christ's. The disciples' methods are not different from Christ's. The disciple will not be loved or accepted more than Christ was. The disciple will not gain a bigger audience than Christ did. When all was said and done, Jesus, he was rejected even by his closest disciples. And so I want to think about this just in a broader context than I think I know more than Jesus, or I think I'm the stuff and morally acceptable and I surpass, I deserve to sit as judge over people even when Jesus humbled himself. Even more than that, it comes to, we think, we get grand visions of ministry. We think somehow we're going to gain followers and followers, church attendees, and we're going to have to expand the walls, and we're going to have to build new buildings. And we're thinking like grandeur in ministry, when that wasn't even the case for Jesus' ministry, right? A bunch of people would follow him, and then he would start teaching, and all these people that were following him because of the miracles, this teaching is too difficult, I am out of here. And that was the norm for Jesus' ministry. Why would we think we would ever have a greater audience than Jesus? One. Two, why would we ever think that the results that we could earn could possibly be better than the results Jesus would earn? And so even in that sense, these disciples, they're about to go out on a mission trip, and Jesus is telling them this. Do you remember what they said about me? They will say the same thing about you. We'll get there in the text. They will say the same thing about you. You're going out to practice missions and evangelism. Don't get a big head and think that, by your going out and serving people and preaching this message, that a bunch of people are going to start following you, because you are not greater than your teacher. Look what they did to your teacher. So this is in the context of persecution. Remember last week's Bible study, right? All about persecution, being hated by people. Jesus was certainly hated, and he was maligned by people. So we shouldn't expect different results. We shouldn't expect a different type of audience. It shouldn't be our expectation. And I'm amazed at how often it is the expectation when it certainly was my expectation when I got into ministry. I remember we went to a leadership camp, super summer, at Oklahoma Baptist University. This is while I was still in high school. I think I was a senior in high school. Went to a leadership camp, and a guy named Ryan Young stood up and he spoke to us. He's like the cool, charismatic youth guy. And he wore a jersey, and he had the hand motions, and it was cool, fun to listen to. And I remember sitting there and being inspired, not by the message, but just by his charisma, and the fact that when he would say certain things, the audience would clap for him and would cheer for, in response to what he was saying. And I don't know if, I can't judge anybody in the audience for clapping at the person or to Christ. I don't know who they were clapping for. And I don't remember his message, so it's like I can't criticize that because I don't know. It could have been Christ-centered. And knowing Ryan, it probably was, because I know him, and he's one of the guys that inspired me into ministry, even beyond that. So God bless him. But I remember thinking to myself, well, wouldn't that be cool? And this is right around the time God is calling me into ministry. And so I get into ministry, and my perception of church ministry is I get to be in front of people, which actually I didn't like being in front of people, but I was like, people are going to clap for me and people are going to love it. And that was part of my perception getting into ministry. And it was completely the opposite, right? Especially when you start actually preaching through the Bible. Elders of the church, pastors of the church, get criticized more when they're doing their job according to Scripture, instead of just doing what people sort of expect of them to do. Because people expect some pretty unbiblical things of pastors and elders. But then there's a lot of criticism that just comes along. And then here we read, a disciple is not greater than his teacher. And it's sort of just right in there. It's like, oh yeah, I remember reading the Gospels and seeing how bad they treated Jesus. A disciple is not above his master. What do you think about the first part of verse 25 here? After saying a disciple is not above his teacher, nor a slave above his master, Jesus continues, it is enough for the disciple that he become like his teacher, and the slave like his master. What do you think? Why do you think Jesus clarifies that specifically like he does? It's enough for you to be like me. So I read here Matthew chapter 10 verse 25. And Jesus he's saying you're going to win as many people as I win, because I'm the one winning people ultimately through you anyway, right? You're going to win as many people as I win. It is not your goal to simply just persuade people to follow me, Jesus. I don't want you to be manipulative. I just want you to go out, tell people what I've told you. And we'll get to that in this text too. Here he says, it is enough for the disciple that he become like his teacher, and the slave like his master. And so here we're going to answer question number 1. What is God's purpose for mission and evangelism? Here we see it, right? Mission and evangelism isn't primarily for the purpose of our growing the numbers of a church. We've talked about this. Our growing the numbers of a church, or our getting a lot of people to follow Jesus, or our getting some people to pray a prayer. That's not how we gauge our success. That's not the goal in evangelism or missions. Instead, the goal is for us that we become like the teacher, and then we become like our master, Jesus Christ. The goal is our sanctification. It's our being conformed to the image of Jesus Christ. And so when we practice missions and evangelism, that's like a key part of our Christianity, right? Without this, we are missing out on like a whole lot of spiritual growth that comes along with this. This is one means by which we are sanctified as followers of Jesus Christ. Now, who receives the glory in this? It's God the Father, because we're not trying to convince a lot of people to come and follow us and build our church. God the Father gets the glory, and Christ is exalted in this process, because all of a sudden our lives are a testimony to Him, and we are sanctified. We are being conformed to the image of Christ in this process. And so you ask, why the Calvinist would practice evangelism if he or she believes that God is the one working all things together, and that God saves His people according to His will. The purpose for evangelism is not that we would go and bring a bunch of people to the church building and get a bunch of people to say a prayer and get as many people as possible into heaven. The goal is glory of God, exaltation of Jesus, our sanctification in Christ. And without practicing missions and evangelism, it's really difficult to be like Christ. What does Christ do? What's the nature of his work? What does He do? And we kind of mentioned this already. Humbles Himself, condescends to people, serves people, dies for people on a cross. That is Jesus Christ exemplifying from the beginning. In the Old Testament, He does this too, right? The angel of the Lord goes to people, explains Christ. Christ has always been doing this work, coming to people, revealing God. Christ is the missionary of the Godhead. Christ is the evangelist of the Godhead. Christ is always going, always revealing the Father. How can we be like Jesus? How can we in any way represent the life of Christ? How can we in any way be like Christ if we're not practicing evangelism and missions? This is just how we live like Christ. And in that, one of the ways He sanctifies us, we get to the second part of verse 25 here. the way this happens is Jesus, he clarifies for us, if they have called the head of the house, who's the head of the house? Jesus. The head of the house, Beelzebul, reflecting back on Matthew chapter 9, verse 34, where some religious leaders accused Jesus of casting out demons by the ruler of demons, right? And that's not the last time they will do that. But if they have called the head of the household Beelzebul, a name for Satan, how much more will they malign the members of his household? And so one of the ways in which we are sanctified and become like Christ is we go out and we practice missions and people malign us like they maligned Christ. And this works out for our good, for our sanctification. Is it the case that God will never build a big local church or a big ministry for his glory? I mean, if this is the rule, that people will be rejected and people will be maligned, and that most people will reject the gospel, but this is for the glory of God, the exaltation of Christ, the sanctification of believers. Is it ever the case that God would build a big local church or would build a big ministry? And that is actually an important question in light of the text. But what do you think? Are all big churches false churches?
No.
Okay.
No.
All right. So help me think about this. If the norm is people reject the gospel, how do we have big, huge congregations today? Yeah, and I think so. We understand regarding like big churches who are serving Christ well, gospel-centered. We understand big ministries. We understand that if we take Jesus' teaching seriously here, that's going to be the exception to the rule. Normally, the big churches, big ministries, successful ministries, normally it's because they found a formula that works. They plug in this, and this, entertain people into seats. You tell people what they want to hear, make people feel good. That's I can pretty well figure out a formula for any geographical area that would cause a church to grow really, really rapidly. And it's not going to be gospel-centered, and it's not going to be Christ-centered. So God does do that. It's probably the exception to the rule. The norm is rejection, malignment from people. And Jesus is honest about this. You are not above your teacher. They did this to me, they will do it to you. And you're right. If God builds a mega church, and it really is Christ building his local church right there in that building, he's doing it for a purpose. And the purpose is the glory of the Father, exaltation of the Son, sanctification of God's chosen people. It's not to exalt a pastor, teacher, person, an entertainer or motivational speaker or musician. It's glory of God, exaltation of Christ, sanctification of God's chosen people. And I've experienced this too, as my own ministry grows, right? And I'm striving to stay true to the Scriptures and preach through the Scriptures. As it grows, persecution becomes more and more intensified, right? And so the leaders of God has in his, true, healthy local churches who are bigger churches or bigger ministries that have more influence, more people involved, and those people there, I think the persecution on that person whom God has put in charge, the persecution there, the hatred there, the malignment of that person, I think it's just going to be more intense because God has given them a more prominent role. Maybe not a bigger role, because that's kind of weird to say, but maybe a more prominent role. You can see why the disciples of Jesus Christ would be maybe fearful about what was coming at this point. Like, this is like their first little short mission trip, and Jesus is saying they're going to malign you, they're going to hate you, they're going to persecute you, and no one's going to accept your message.
Well,
and it's like, well, thanks, Jesus. Like, I'm afraid now.
So much.
And then we get to verse 26. Therefore, do not fear them. Who?
Yeah.
The maligners, the persecutors, the haters.
Yeah.
Do not fear them, for there is nothing concealed that will not be revealed, or hidden that will not be known. Christ, it's good that Christ takes the time to encourage them right here. What do you think he's getting at with this encouragement? What they say about you will not remain a secret. What they criticize you and accuse you of it will be revealed before the Almighty is the pointing of the text, right? Before the Almighty, before the one who judges justly. There is nothing hidden that will not be known. They will not be able to cover up their sin. They will not be able to cover up their unrighteousness. Your accusers, those who malign you, who mock you, who hate you, who persecute you, there will be justice done. And so this is happening for your sanctification so that you might be like your teacher, that's Jesus Christ. And those who mock you, they will be judged by the just judge. Since Christ's apostles are to expect to be maligned, as Christ has been, Jesus instructs them not to fear those who do the maligning, the maligners. Christ will reveal everything they speak. He will make it known to their shame because he is the righteous judge. We don't have to fear them or respond in kind. We don't have to condemn the maligners. We don't judge because that is God's position and not ours. God is working together even the false testimony of maligners for his children's good. There's sanctification in the context of this passage, right? So God's working even when people talk badly about us or mock us, it's God working that together for our good. He's the one in control here, right? That we may be like our teacher, Jesus Christ. We stay about God's affairs, marching onward. It's easy for those little things to distract us, and we think, I have to respond to this, have to do that, have to defend myself, have to make sure everything's good, have to make sure my enemies are not where they can touch me. But instead, the application we make from this text is we just stay about God's affairs, marching onward in his evangelistic mission for the purpose of his glory, Christ's exaltation, and our sanctification. No matter who maligns us, what do? Focus on the mission. Focus on Christ. The work of evangelism in missions. Verse 27. What I tell you in the darkness, speak in the light, and what you hear whispered in your ear, proclaim on the housetops. What is Jesus? He's back to instruction. We just think about what's going on here. What was going on in the Sermon on the Mount? Jesus was teaching just his disciples. What's going on here? Jesus is instructing just his disciples. And here Jesus says, what I tell you in darkness, what nobody else can hear besides you, go and make it known to them. Right? Go proclaim this from the rooftops. Go to the public square and teach people what I am teaching. And so it's like, even in our church, what usually happens in churches, even in churches where the gospel is being preached, and it's being preached really well, and people are walking through the scriptures, people will walk through the word of Christ in the church, and then it doesn't make it outside the walls.
Right.
It's just Christians getting together and listening. Jesus here, and if you didn't catch that, Jesus is saying, what I'm teaching you is to be proclaimed to the world by you. By what we learn in church, we take out. And this is why we go through great pains here, right? To make all of our teaching public. That's why we post it online and take advantage of all that stuff. And we tell our people, go share these videos, go share these notes for these Bible lessons, go and share, go tell people about Christ. We are to transmit what we learn, the very words of Christ that he has inspired, I believe, in both the Old and New Testament. We are to be transmitting this. And so when we're here, we're being equipped for this ministry. And Jesus is saying, do not be inwardly focused where you are just coming and gaining for yourself. Your whole ministry, your life as a Christian, if you're living on mission, if you're doing evangelism, if you're being like Christ, being like your teacher, you're taking this and you're focused outwardly. Like, this is the lifestyle of the Christian. This is what it means. Take this, proclaim it in the marketplace of ideas. Proclaim this message. Verse 28, do not fear those, and here we see the instruction again, do not fear those who kill the body, but are unable to kill the soul. And Jesus repeated himself there, but here he clarifies just a little bit. But rather, fear him who is able to destroy both soul and body in hell. What is Jesus Christ acknowledging here that we are sometimes afraid to acknowledge on our own? This is a pretty serious bomb that Jesus drops, right? And it basically acknowledges, it's not just acknowledgement, but Jesus, being God in the flesh, is basically saying, I am the one. God the Father is the one who ordains. I reveal it. I am the one with the explicit authority to send people to hell, body and soul. Period. All they can do is kill your body.
Mm-hmm.
That's it. Who's more powerful here, God or people?
Right.
Well, God is.
Right.
You're worried about what people think. You're worried about, you're a Christian. You're worried about what people think. You're worried about your reputation. You're worried about not being accepted by them. Look, it is much worse for God not to accept you than for people not to accept you. Fear God, not people, because God is way more powerful. God will do way more damage, and he will do that damage more deeper. He will do the deepest damage. When God kills, it's final. It's done. If people kill you, God can still save you out of that. But if God kills you, it's it. Done. We have reason to fear God and not people. We have more reason to fear God than we do to fear people. Yet, it is a response of most Christians. And the context here is persecution. We don't forget that. You're being maligned, you're being hated, you're being persecuted. And the apostles will go through all sorts of terrible things, right? They will be stoned and they will be hung on crosses. The disciples will go through that. And still, it's hard not to fear that. It's such a present danger. One test of a true disciple asks whether we care more about what others think or what God thinks. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And if we really care more about what God thinks, chances are we're really following Christ, because you're not going to have that thought. Really, if we're honest with ourselves, we're not going to have that thought. We might try and convince ourselves that we have that thought, but really I'm just doing some things to be accepted by people and trying to make it seem religious, if we're honest with ourselves, sincere, and we have that thought, no, I really just care what God thinks more than I care what people think. And so I just want to obey him despite what people think. We probably really are following Christ. Verse 29. Are not 2 sparrows sold for a cent or a penny? And yet not one of them will fall to the ground apart from your Father. But the very hairs on your head are all numbered. So do not fear. You are more valuable than many sparrows. This verse is usually referred to, people will just quote it just when they're thinking about the worth of people. And it does say something about the worth of people.
Mm-hmm.
But normally they'll quote it in a sense to mean God thinks you are worth so much more than you think you're worth. Or God thinks you're worth so much. And God even provides for the sparrows. Will he not provide everything that you need? And then we have Christians starving and Christians being persecuted to death and all of those things, where this verse doesn't actually get at, Jesus loves you so much more than the sparrows, and so he's going to provide every single one of your needs. We might be able to glean something like that from other verses of Scripture. But this verse doesn't get at that. What do you think this part of the text is getting at? All right, so remember the primary context here is it's evangelism. It's this mission trip. It's evangelism and missions. The secondary context is the persecution and maligning that is to be expected when on God's mission. Notice the focus of Jesus' illustration. It's not the life of the bird. It's the death of the bird, of the sparrow. It's the death. And since people, particularly his apostles, are more valuable to him than many sparrows, will he not also care over their deaths? They don't have to fear people because they cannot fall to the ground apart from the working of the Father. Put simply, if it's not our time, we won't go.
That's right.
Exactly.
And if it is our time, there's nothing that can stop us from going.
That's right.
Period. That's the truth we receive in this text. What are some ways that you think we are often, or we might be, guilty of fearing people rather than God? God is presented His
Fearing-
power is here.
Fearing people rather than God.
Yeah, and so what are some ways that we might fear people rather than God? And I'll give one example here in a minute, but let me hear from you
Well, I
first.
think it's
This previous Sunday. In the United States, many pastors stood up across the nation and said something about church security, and it was responsive to what happened in Texas and what happened in New York, right? Violence is getting worse. We need to stay protected. These are many of the things that are said, right? We need to stay protected. We need armed security to make that happen. We've got a plan, right? Look, it is good to be prudent.
it's good to be what?
Prudent.
Yes.
Take care of things that need to be taken care of. Our church does have a security team. Most of our people are armed anyway. Still, if we're to take this verse seriously, even regarding armed security and people being armed, we cannot act out of fear and responsively to these things going on. We cannot lose sight of the fact that God is in control of every situation. He cares over the way that we die, right? He cares over that. When we die for the exaltation of Christ to the glory of the Father. Our priority, in spite of physical danger, then, is not just to protect ourselves. That's not the main goal. We do want to. That's not the main goal. Our priority, in spite of physical danger, is evangelism and missions to the glory of God. And we are sanctified through that. We fear God, not people, because God is all-powerful, and we really actually believe that. Like He is all-powerful. Verses 32 and 33. Therefore, everyone who confesses me before men, I will also confess him before my Father who is in heaven. The context is missions and evangelism. Remember that. But whoever denies me before men, probably in context because they fear people more than God, but whoever denies me before men, I will also deny him before my Father who is in heaven. Christ will deny those who do not publicly proclaim His explicit word as He has given it. The context is missions and evangelism. Who don't love Him in such a way that they tell the world, proclaim it from the rooftops in the marketplace of ideas. How is this not like works-based righteousness? Just really quickly.
Because we've already been saved by grace.
All right. Yes, absolutely. From the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew's Gospel, Jesus' anthropology has been root produces fruit, not the other way around. We see that in Matthew chapter 7, verses 15 through 20. False prophets and people who don't really love Christ are revealed by their fruit when they fear people more than they fear God. This refusal to practice missions and evangelism, to be outwardly focused, is fruit, not root. There is necessarily a bad heart condition that produces the bad fruit, a rejection of practicing evangelism and missions. Jesus presents two evidences that can be observed to distinguish between real Christians and people who only claim to be Christians. One, we become focused outward and desire to practice evangelism such that we cannot keep silent. And two, our confession is Christ's word, not ours. Consider the apostles' response in Acts chapter 4, verse 20, after being warned not to preach in Jesus' name any longer. They said, we cannot. It's a statement of ability, not willingness, right? A statement of ability. We cannot stop speaking about what we have seen and heard. It's impossible for us to do that. It's a statement of ability. It was impossible for them to stop because they feared God, not men. We can infer from this text that there's a difference being drawn between outward and inward focus. Outward focus is twofold, and we're going to answer the third question here. First, we're striving to reach people outside the church walls and not giving all of our attention, money, and time to the inward ministries of the church body. Everything is evangelistic and missional. Second, we are serving God's glory, not ours. And so we're focused outward in two directions. Evangelism, missions, glory of God. None of it's coming back on us. Like none of it. Right? So people will say, I don't like this church because I'm not being fed. There it is. Now there is a real sense in which the teaching of Scripture, it needs to be a correct teaching of Scripture. Some people mean that when they say I'm not being fed. So I don't want to criticize that too hard. But missions, glory of God. It's all focused outward. That's what Christ calls us to. We are not self-promoting. We are God-promoting. Inward focus is for people who are self-interested. So, the person who resolves only to fill a seat in a church is more concerned about his or her own preferences, or about being served, or constantly complains because they believe things ought to be different is, according to Christ, either just a really immature Christian, or they don't know Christ at all because they don't fear God in this way, and they're not practicing God's mission in this way. Here she tries to earn glory for self rather than serve God's glory by focusing on numbers, recognition, and how they might feel persecuted, and they focus all on that. Like, this is so wrong, and this is being done to me, and I feel like everybody is just, and all the focus is on me, how I've been wronged, what I'm doing correctly, what I think I need to be getting out of the church service, the way I think things need to be. It's all about me. We sing a worship song in church. It's all about me. No, we don't, but that's...
Doesn't that sound like a Frank Sinatra?
All right, so who is the only one who actually has the right to be inwardly focused?
Jesus Christ.
That'd be God, right? That'd be the Father, because he is the one to receive all glory. Yet, in Christ, he condescended so that his people might know him. And so local churches that are inwardly focused, they're not true local churches. At least they're not healthy, true local churches. They might be a church that really is built by Christ, really is a true local church, but they're going to be about as far from healthy as you can get if all the focus is inward on the people, just in the congregation. All the ministries serve just the people in the congregation, and it's not missional and evangelistic, right? And so that's what the text gets at today, and that certainly a convicting truth.